Hello, and welcome to the Literacy for Professional Purposes module. Each screen in this slideshow will give you the main bullet points. By the end of this module, you will have considered the importance of effective professional written communication, examined the ingredients of good writing in this context, explored some different forms of written communication, studied the importance of language and grammar, and understood the advantages of fully understanding and reflecting before responding to or initiating the written communication. Before we actually begin, it would be useful to consider an initial question, that of whether in fact the choice of written communication is necessarily the most appropriate for the circumstances in question. Would you always use the written word as your medium? If not, do you think there would be instances under which you might prefer to communicate verbally? Can you give examples of instances when that might be the case? And to take this a stage further, can you envisage circumstances where communicating via the written word, as opposed to the spoken word, could even be counterproductive? When and why might you prefer to speak directly to someone rather than write to them, and vice versa? And what might those situations be? The first issue for consideration is, why written communication? Just what is it that makes it so important for the professional within an organization? First, in one way or another, and at some stage, written forms of communication will be relevant to everyone within the workplace. Whether you are a recipient or the originator, some understanding is required in terms of either how to write or how to interpret what has been written. Secondly, the expression and elucidation of organizational objectives through writing is essential if the aims and the objectives of that organization are to be achieved, whether via mission statements, policy documents, or memos. Thirdly, clear written communication is essential for understanding in all contexts, including statements, requests, announcements, and instructions. Fourthly, well-structured and written communications are necessary in clarifying the information that is being transmitted, for whatever that purpose might be. Finally, the crucial aspect of organizational transparency is achieved through well-crafted written communication. Everyone knows where they stand and that there are no hidden agendas. Whatever form the written communication takes, and there are several possible formats, it is essential that it possesses the following characteristics to enable fellow professionals and, where relevant, lay people to function effectively, and for the organization itself to maintain its professionalism, both in the way it perceives itself and, ultimately, in the manner in which outside agencies perceive it. First, the communication should address the subject directly, and leave the recipient in no doubt regarding what it is that is being addressed. It should be clear and unambiguous throughout, avoiding either beating around the bush or using language that serves to obscure, or that can be interpreted in more than one way. It needs to be direct and to the point, so that the reader does not have to plough through quantities of text which is written and expressed in a roundabout way before arriving at the point of communication. Jargon is often so embedded within organizations that it is both spoken and written, almost a second nature and integral to the work. Good professional written communication should, however, be jargon-free, particularly if the terms used tend to obscure rather than clarify meaning. The terminology used should, therefore, be correct and relevant to the context. All professional written communication should be designed for a clear purpose, not written just for the sake of it. Quantity does not necessarily equate with quality, and there may be those who, with the written equivalent, like the sound of their own voice, but do not always write for any clear purpose. Finally, whatever the circumstances, both the content and the medium should be appropriate for the target audience, if the objectives of that communication are to be achieved. The language that might be commonplace among one sector of the workforce will not necessarily readily transfer to another. So if the written communication is to go to everyone in the workplace, it should be modelled with this in mind. An issue that affects all written communications across the board is grammar. This is an element often dismissed or deemed of secondary importance, but is nevertheless very important for the maintaining of professionalism within the organisation, the image of that organisation as presented to the outside world, and, perhaps crucially, essential in order to facilitate understanding and avoid misunderstanding. You might want to do this exercise by yourself or with a colleague, but click below and read the memo. Then list, identify and comment upon any problems you find. How might it be improved? Then click here to compare your findings with the analysis below. The forms of written communication in the professional context that we will be examining are reports and briefings, letters, memos, minutes, and written communications delivered through an electronic medium. Not all these formats might be equally appropriate for you in your particular workplace, but you will almost certainly be able to apply the basic generic principles involved in most of them at one time or another. A typical format for a report would involve starting with the terms of reference, that is, a summary of the reason for the report and its stated scope and coverage. Think of it as a sort of statement of intent that is designed to leave the reader in no doubt about the contents. By the same token, having set out terms of reference at the outset, be careful not to stray from those set out in the report itself. As is the case with a trial in a court of law, you cannot suddenly introduce new evidence once the existing evidence has been set out, particularly in the conclusion itself. The procedure informs the reader how the investigation is conducted, the processes involved, and the methods employed. The findings and discussion combine a descriptive element, what was established from the investigation, with an analysis, discussion and interpretation of those findings. The conclusion draws logical conclusions based upon the findings, which naturally progress to the final recommendations, where the author puts forward a series of proposed actions based upon the results of the findings, in order to take things forward, address a particular problem or issue, or progress in a particular direction. The report should be written in a concise, factual style, avoiding verbosity and giving opinions, interpretation and analysis that draw conclusions mainly from the facts and conclusions in the report itself. The language used should therefore be plain, direct and, in so far as it is possible, jargon-free, using short, punchy paragraphs and sentences and avoiding at all costs rambling statements where the point made is obscured and the reader struggles to understand the meaning. In effect, ensure clarity rather than opacity at all times. In terms of structure, reports can be broken down into bite-sized numbered paragraphs. For example, 2.1, 2.2, etc. Using plain sans serif font like Arial with font size 11 or 12 points and 1.5 or double spacing. Choose between using capitals, bold, italics and or underlining for emphasis. As in all cases, having chosen one style, it is important to be consistent and stick with that one, rather than mixing a variety of styles throughout the report. A report should deal in language expressed simply, so that the contents are concise and to the point. There is no room for embellishments, verbosity, and any style which diverts attention from or obscures the main points. One suggestion is to keep to the simple tenses, mainly the present, avoiding, for example, subjunctive, conditional, or any tense which introduces doubt or uncertainty to the equation. Recommendations can be expressed in punchy bullet points, each one starting with an action verb, in the imperative, which best introduces the recommendation. For example, discuss, comply, eradicate, investigate, etc. As with all written communications, those organizational ones in a professional context should therefore be transparent, well structured, with clearly delineated paragraphs, with close attention given to grammar and spelling. A briefing is not as detailed as a report. Rather than describing or focusing upon a process that has taken place, it is designed to look at a particular scenario and propose some form of action. Its main constituents are the introduction, which briefly sets the scene and outlines the current state of play. It asks the question, where are we now? Or what is the present situation or status quo? Next, the requirements are set out. What is the desired outcome, or where do we want to be? And specifically, what do we want to achieve? The evidence that supports this is then provided, along with the question that the brief finally asks, which is, what do we need to do to achieve this? And proceeds to set out a brief strategy or proposed action plan that makes up the conclusion. The brief is much more focused than a report, setting out the essence of the proposal or argument in as few words as possible. In effect, it acts as a springboard or starting point to promote further action on recommendations. Business letters follow a particular format that reflects the comparative formality of this type of organizational communication. The business address goes at the top right-hand side of the page, as would your home address were you writing an ordinary informal letter, with the day's date underneath. The reference, if there is one, then goes across on the left-hand side, level with the date on the right. Underneath that, Dear is followed by Sir or Madam if you are not writing to a named individual. Otherwise it is either Mr., Mrs. or Ms., the latter if the individual in question has not used a specific title herself. In cases of extreme informality, if you are already on first name terms and the purpose of the letter made it appropriate, you could use the person's first name. Then, separated by a couple of spaces on each side, is the purpose of the letter, usually bold and underlined, for example, re-meeting 5/1/2011. This is followed by the introduction, a form of lead-in concerning the purpose of the letter. From this point, the letter will move to specifics, each point being a separate paragraph. This ensures clarity by keeping the points separated from each other, making it easier for the reader both to follow and to reread and revisit particular points at issue. The conclusion then draws the letter together, often making some sort of final statement, request, or giving a pointer to further action. Aligned with the beginning of the final line of the conclusion, the letter is then signed Yours faithfully, if it was started by Dear Sir or Madam, and Yours sincerely if you've named the individual. If the letter is less formal, and you know the person well, you could use something like Best regards or just Yours. Your signature would then go underneath, just your first name if extremely informal, with your full name clearly typed under the signature to ensure clarity. Under the signature and type name separated by a double space goes the name, together with the job title, and address of the person and organization to whom and to which you are writing. The memo is a more succinct and less formal means of communication that is, in the first instance, intended to grab the reader's attention more than imparting a large amount of information. Its intention is, typically, to inform, recommend, or ask for some form of action in a direct and concise manner, so it is likely to lack any discursive elements, as this is not its intended function. Having said that, a polite please and thank you never comes amiss with a brief communication, so as not to appear too terse, curt, or abrupt. The main point or purpose of a memo should be immediately evident and addressed in the first paragraph, rather than keeping the reader guessing. It might be that it is sent with the intention of offering support to a position you have taken, or to act as a pointer to the rationale for taking a particular course of action. It might also have the function of conveying next steps and associated deadlines for actions. Minutes are necessary to maintain a formal record of what was said by whom during a meeting, and to record who has agreed to take what particular action or actions as a consequence. They will normally follow a strict format which is adhered to throughout, and will typically contain the following elements. First, the agenda of the meeting, which numbers the items for discussion in a particular set order. If any of the items are to be spoken to by a particular person, their initials are usually included next to the item. A person then takes responsibility for making a written record of what is said at that meeting. Secondly, the minutes of the previous meeting are attached and usually first checked for accuracy by participants at the meeting. When it has been agreed that the minutes are an accurate reflection of what was said, the chair will normally then sign off those minutes. The matters arising which follows records any further corrections, additions, updates, etc. on items from the previous minutes. The minute taker will then record ensuing discussions at the meeting. Minutes should not be a verbatim account of what is said, but rather a record of the main points, outcomes, action points, and who is responsible for carrying out those actions as a result of the discussions. Items of any other business or extra items not covered by the agenda items are often requested at the beginning of the meeting, but can also be accepted at the end and will be recorded in the minutes, usually in the shortened form of AOB. Finally, the date of the next meeting is decided whenever possible and recorded at the end of the minutes. Minutes as written communication require using the direct, uncomplicated, unambiguous language of reporting events. Part of the skill, which like others improves with practice, involves not even attempting to record what has been said verbatim, but rather selecting the salient points and recording them as brief, direct sentences. In effective minute-taking, the emphasis is upon the skill of knowing what to omit as well as what to include. The temptation to record everything that everyone says should be resisted, and unless you were actually to transcribe the speech word for word from some recording device, it is virtually impossible anyway. Identifying and using keywords to express and convey the sense of what has been said is a useful technique to practice. At a day-to-day level, written communication delivered electronically, especially in the form of email, tends to have largely supplanted paper as a medium within organizations. The advantages of email are legion, particularly for communicating speedily with several recipients simultaneously, sending attachments such as agendas, minutes, proposals, and rapid turnaround of reply. That said, as a form of asynchronous communication, that is, the sender and receiver do not have to be communicating with each other simultaneously, email allows the opportunity to reflect and think about the response before actually replying. There will be occasions where this is particularly advantageous. Like the memo, the main topic of the email appears straight away, so that the recipient knows immediately the reason for receiving it. The typical email, like a memo, provides a template structure which the sender simply fills in and includes date sent, name of recipient, a CC field for others to whom the email is to be circulated, the subject of the email, and the main text of the message being sent. Either an automatically generated signature, including workplace address, can be set up for each message sent, or the sender simply types their name at the end, or both. The advantages of email can also present as disadvantages in a way that makes it even more vital that clarity, brevity, and literacy are observed when communicating by email. The speed at which emails can be turned around can, at the same time, present a potential problem in that misunderstandings can occur and meaning can appear ambiguous, resulting in misinterpretation and negative response. This makes it all the more important that plain, simple, direct and grammatically correct language is used. Even more importantly, it is essential to reflect and think through a response before simply sending it straight off. In recognition of the fact that the rapidity of email response can almost result in conversation, it is also acknowledged that the non-verbal cues received between participants in face-to-face conversation do not exist in email exchanges, and it can be, for example, even more difficult to discern whether someone is being literal, humorous, ironic, or sincere. Hence the use of emoticons, like smiley faces. When writing in a professional context, it is far better to leave out any language that could be misconstrued. Keeping it plain, simple, and unambiguous is by far the better option. If there exists even a slight justification to include an emoticon, which would certainly never be used in a formal context anyway, better to avoid the line altogether and just make it direct, literal, and to the point. The best way to avoid misunderstandings is simply not to risk using language or phraseology expressed in a way that could be misconstrued in the first place. For example, leave out humour unless you are completely sure it will be understood and is appropriate. There are also issues of etiquette. For example, using capitals should be avoided in emails as it is interpreted as shouting. So far, we have predominantly focused upon how we communicate by writing in a professional context. We shall now examine the opposite side of the coin. But how should we actually read the communications we receive in an organization? In examining written communication, it might initially appear strange that one should need to consider the way we read and assimilate that which we receive. But the manner in which you read a communication, your own preconceptions, and indeed the mood you're in at the time, can significantly influence the response you give and the ensuing outcomes of that response. For example, if you're in a negative and irritable mood when reading a written communication, it's all the more likely that you could interpret the contents in a pejorative fashion and give a negative response, thus setting off a series of bad-tempered exchanges which could have a negative effect on the protagonists, those around them, and ultimately be counterproductive to the department or organization. This applies particularly to the electronic medium, where the speed of response possible can be both an advantage and a disadvantage, and you will probably have heard of the so-called flame wars that have broken out on email. There are, however, a number of steps you can take to avoid such pitfalls and to gain the most out of written communications. First, reading is often misconstrued as a passive activity. Nothing could be farther from the truth. It is crucial that any professional communication is read actively and critically with an alert and inquiring mind, as it is vital to feel you have understood fully the meaning and implications before responding. Whatever those implications might be, your response should be objective and measured. In fact, all the more so if, for example, the subject is an emotive one. For the vast majority of the time, of course, the subject you encounter will be routine and administrative. Avoid allowing assumptions, prejudices, or emotion to fuel your response, and perhaps above all, avoid personalizing things to too great an extent. Whether you're about to send a written communication or you have received one to which you are about to respond, think about the outcome that you would most like. Think then about whether what you would like to say is compatible with the positive outcome that you seek. Your emotions might make you feel like employing sarcasm, irony, or sheer anger in your response. But would that actually achieve your preferred aims? Is the attitude, "I'll show him," actually going to achieve your objectives, or will it simply serve to antagonize and ultimately prove counterproductive? Of course, were you to take this stance with, for example, staff you line manage, it could not only be counterproductive, but also construed as bullying. So the importance of thinking through your response cannot be emphasized too greatly. In fact, it is a good rule of thumb that applies also to any written communication you are initiating. One possible approach is to imagine that you are the recipient of the intended piece. Read it through as they would, and then decide whether what you have written is well judged, appropriate, and if it is likely to elicit the positive response that you require. One of the downsides of email, for example, is that not only is it a medium that allows you to dash off a written response quickly, but after you've hit the send button, there is little you can do to retrieve the situation. Of course, due to hasty overreaction, you might also have copied others into your response that you might later regret. If, however, you apply the following 4 steps: 1. Read critically. 2. Assimilate. 3. Understand. And 4. Reflect before you respond, then you should be well placed for dealing with written communications. Reading and making notes. The last aspect of the Literacy for Professional Purposes module involves reading and making notes. Both these activities are interrelated, as there will be many occasions when you will need to take effective notes from written material. We all read in different ways, depending on the nature of the reading that we're doing, but in the case of academic reading, it's important that we read strategically. Derek Rountree refers, for example, to the SQ3R method, where the first step is to survey or skim a chapter, identifying headings without straight away reading the whole text. The second step is Q or question. What is this about? And looking for questions in the chapter. The third R is for read, which you now do having done the groundwork in S and Q. The second R is recite, write or recall, using key phrases to identify major points and answers to questions. Finally, R or review is where the learner can test themselves by trying to recall key phrases. Whatever reading strategy you adopt, just find the one that works best for you. The first point with effective reading is read actively and critically, so you can conduct an internal dialogue that challenges and questions. Plan your reading so that you give yourself breaks and opportunities to pause for reflection. Choose the time and place that works best for you. We're all different in our preferences, some preferring different times of the day and others preferring quiet to background noise. Very important is to be selective in what you read, assessing what is relevant and under no circumstances attempting to read everything in detail. Try to find the reading technique that works for you. For example, try to learn speed reading techniques. Always make critical and concise notes on key points and arguments in the text. Again, very important is to assimilate and understand what you have read, so reflection and rereading is essential. Making notes is an active process that involves effective and conscious selection, analysis and summarizing of material, whether you're making notes from lectures, meetings or written texts. Probably the most popular form of note making is sequential or linear, writing down the main points in the order that you hear or read them. It's important only to note down keywords and concepts and not even attempt to write large quantities of tracts. If you leave spaces or margins on the page, you can annotate later, and it's good to highlight, underline or asterisk important points. Another form of note making is visual, which brings into play mind mapping, spider diagrams and any pictorial way of expressing and linking concepts, so you end up with a holistic overview rather than a set sequence of ideas. You need to establish which suits you, and in some cases you might find that a hybrid form, combining the two, works well. So, ensure you always carry the kit you need for making notes, including possibly different colour pens and highlighters and enough paper. Try different techniques to find which suits you best. Very importantly, be selective and don't even try to write everything down, but focus on keywords and key concepts. Make a note of anything you don't understand, so you can check back later. Organize your notes so you can easily locate what you need, and always make a clear note of any sources, ensuring you can access the information you need to cite them fully in your references or bibliography. Finally, review your notes regularly, using active reading techniques to consolidate your learning. It's crucial to remember that both reading and note-making are active, not passive activities, so ask questions, challenge and process the information actively as you read and write. You have now reached the end of the Literacy for Professional Purposes module, and we hope you will have found some useful tips along the way. To sum up, always go for the best form of communication according to the situation. There will be occasions where a face-to-face conversation will be more appropriate than, say, a letter. Next, make sure that what you write is coherent, easily understood and to the point, with no spelling or grammatical mistakes. Use clear paragraphs separating any points you're making. Make sure you read through and think about what you are sending rather than sending it straight out. One rule of thumb you can apply is to imagine that you're in the place of the person receiving it. Would you, if you were in their shoes, be able to immediately understand and interpret it the right way? And finally, if you're on the receiving end of a written communication, make sure you take time to fully understand it before you respond. Never allow emotion to cloud your judgment or affect your response, and avoid any temptation to fire back angry, sarcastic or otherwise negative responses. So until next time, goodbye. The further information provides you with a series of links that you can dip into and explore. These are optional extras, and you won't necessarily find all of them useful, but they do contain useful information. The grammar website takes you through some useful tips on how to avoid some of the most common errors and is well worth a read. Report writing is produced by Learning Development at Plymouth University and contains valuable information about the structure and content of a good report. The Open University Open Learn link takes you to a list of free modules on a range of skills from report writing to reading and writing skills. Finally, a good site for down-to-earth demystification of some of these skills can be found at businessballs.com. Click the live link and it will take you straight through to the index. Be prepared to dig a bit with this index. For example, minute-taking techniques are buried within meetings. We hope you find at least some of these links under further information useful.